Two candidates that the American public don't want. What goes through my mind is what is the risk of a materially lower voter turnout in that scenario? And this could be injurious actually to Trump relative to Biden.
Well, that's the irony of this situation, right? In my 2024 outlook, I called it inflection point because in my advisory business, talking to global investors, the outcome of the U.S. elections is their number one risk. And to be frank, a return of Trump to the White House is perceived as the number one risk outside of the U.S. So the stakes are incredibly high. But as you point out, you've got an American electorate which is exhausted by politics and unenthusiastic about what's on offer.
And to that point with Biden, I mean, Bloomberg and Morning Consult surveyed swing state voters, and they said he's too old. The swing states were more leaning towards Trump. You have this dialogue over that. You have this dialogue over Israel. If Biden wants to repeat 2020, where he has this coalition of voters, how difficult is that going to be for him at this stage?
So let's remember a few things, right? I call this PQ, your political quotient. This early in the race, Americans haven't made up their minds. We've already discussed that they're underwhelmed by the choices. Pollsters have an incredibly difficult job before them because there never have been so many variables, right? You have a candidate in Donald Trump who's the bookies' favorite and the pollsters' favorite, who is as likely to end up in jail as in the White House. And again, when you have exhausted, overwhelmed voters, U.S. voters focusing on inflation, according to what the survey data tells us, less so on the points that you mentioned, how they choose and if they bother to turn up in a race where they're not feeling it is a great big question.
You talk, I mean, you hit on a myriad of points there, one about the prospect about Donald Trump being in jail, but every time something happens in court seems to embolden his poll numbers, his base, etc. So just leave that for a moment. But you talk about an electorate that doesn't feel it. There is a great economy out there at the moment. Things are on fire. People have jobs. They're getting wage increases. That message is not successfully being translated, or as successfully as it could be translated by the Biden administration. What do they need to do, Tina, in your opinion, to convince the electorate that they have delivered economic success? Is talking about tax rises in State of the Union going to do that?
So it's a very unusual state of affairs. You're quite right to point it out, because let's face it, the metric that pollsters usually use when, sort of outlining what the prospects are is unemployment, growth rates, the so-called misery index, and everything in that respect should be supportive of the incumbent. It should be supportive of Biden. And yet it's really not. I'm not sure that we blame this on age. I'd bring it back maybe to the outlook for the Fed, as you talked about, where in economic circles, there's a lot of talk at the moment about maybe one of the big lessons from this recovery, such as it is that keeping unemployment, at relatively low levels, but with the inflation shock, seems to have dramatic political effects. Although I think this is a particularly American phenomenon. In other developed countries, I live in the UK, they don't expect the executive branch to be setting interest rates in effect and controlling price rises. That's what the Chinese, Communist Party does. It controls prices.
Yes. Does that mean then any hopes of Biden taking back control of the economic message is just not there? He's not going to be able to do that.
I think the narrative will change, put it that way. And in every election, as you get closer, when people don't start thinking about this until September. We're thinking about it. Investors are thinking about it. The rest of the world is thinking about it. Putin and Bibi Netanyahu are thinking they might get a better deal with a different occupant in the White House. Americans are going to see what happens with gas prices and with their grocery shop. There is a lag, a considerable lag, longer than I think investors appreciate, before people start to feel better about things. Doesn't mean Biden will win. I just think that this is more competitive than it looks at this point.
You warn of uncertainty, multiple recounts. You warn of do not assume victory for Biden if it comes through in that way. My question to you is this. Do investors concern themselves that you could have a rerun of the kind of attack on the Capitol that we had previously? Is that a real material risk? What would that do to brand America?
Well, I think that a backlash against the outcome of the elections is almost inevitable at some scale. Let's remember that markets didn't blink with the January 6th events, which is quite remarkable. It was still shocking, but there was very little discernible impact. And so there is still a prevailing sense that American institutions will resolve any difficulty. But, you know, I talked to one very well-placed senior Democrat at a private event last night who said, you know, they think that Trump will get on a plane if he loses because he needs to go somewhere where there's no U.S. extradition treaty. Now, these are just what people are talking about, right? This is not my forecast, but there have never been so many variables at play, both in terms of producing polling projections and weighting, right, weighting the variables, and the high likelihood of disputed outcomes at least dragging out a conclusion. So what I am saying is, if you're holding up your M&A transaction or other kinds of, you know, investments because you're waiting for a signal on November 6th, day after U.S. elections, better plan on a longer time horizon before there's resolution.